I was on holiday and I received I think a WhatsApp message on my phone that just had a photograph of a post-it note that said, Gordon Murray is visiting on Monday. And I thought, well, that obviously isn't going to be the Gordon Murray.
Yeah.
We weren't sure until he came through the door. On the interior design, there were a few little key points that he'd made. Ventilation, weirdly, was one of the key things. On the original Mk I Escort, there's like 2 vents on the dash, and that is it. You can have demist or you can have face air, but you can't have both. So he wanted really good ventilation in there. He didn't want aircon, which is good. So one of the things we were looking at was redesigning the dash so we could get more vents on it, basically. At the time, we were also looking at having a bit of a sat-nav entertainment system in there. But actually, on the second visit, he decided that this wasn't really something he was that fussed about. He said that this is going to be the entertainment system for the car. He said, yeah, the engine noise will be enough for me. We're going to do a smarter set of controls. So we're going to change that console and have rotary switches. And back seat is a big thing. He doesn't want any back seats. He wants a luggage storage area where the back seats would be. So we're going to kind of raise the part of the shell where the front of the back seat would be, the front of the base, kind of here, and bring that up so it creates almost like a bin behind it. And the exterior is almost completely standard, but he just wants it to be lower, wider. This is what I mean about him being just one of us. He just wants it to have a better stance. He wants the wheels right out in the arches. He wants it lower, and that was pretty much it. We talked about tucking the bumpers in a bit tighter and deleting the Ford lettering off the front there. On the back, we're going to get rid of the Ford lettering, leave the Escort lettering, tuck the bumper in tighter to the body, and he was keen for maybe there to be some other detail on the back end which sort of mimicked the vents on the front. The engines on these, although they were okay in the day, that's something that when you turn the key on an old Mk I Escort, it's not exactly a refined experience. And they're not a powerhouse either. I mean, the genuine twin cam engine is reasonably powerful, but the design of it is no better than a modern Duratec. We're going with a Cosworth built one just because it makes sense. They're really well tried and tested. They use them in caterhams, and they offer that as a complete package in various power forms from 200 horsepower to nearly 300 horsepower. And we're probably going to go somewhere in the middle of that. Gearbox wise, that's pretty much a no-brainer. One of the things he said is he wanted a 6-speed box so you can get nice close ratios for thrashing down the country lanes but still have a reasonably tall top gear for cruising. And the 3rd generation Mazda MX-5 had a Mazda branded Duratec in it. The 6-speed box you could get in that consequently mates straight up to a Duratec, so that's what's going in it. I had spoken to a guy who buys and sells quite a lot of Escorts and told him what I want. And I looked at it for 5 minutes before I said, yes, I want it. This one had been painted and I knew there was some damage on it, but underneath it just looked so good. It was surface rusty, but there was no proper rot other than in the floor pans. We've obviously blasted the shell now and it's come out all right. There's a bit more damage than I'd hoped. The rear quarter down there is pretty badly biffed, and the same on the other side. The A-post on that side's taken a fair old hit. This quarter panel's not as bad as the other one. And then front and back have got accident damage as well, albeit quite minor. But on the plus side, there's not any more rust than we thought. There's a little bit here, which we kind of knew was going to be there because they just always go there. This panel you can buy, so that's just going to be a case of replacing that. The front and rear panels, just because of the damage, there's obviously a fair bit of accident damage front and back. So we're just going to replace those panels completely. Again, they're available new. We're going to definitely be replacing the quarter panels. So we had a bit of a chat. What we've decided to do is go with aluminium door skins so they can be wrapped around in the original way, carbon fibre bonnet, and the same with the boot lid. It's lying on this jig bed at the minute, and that gives us a solid datum point for all the modification work we're going to do, but also means we can check for alignment, so we can check the positioning of that sill and the door hinge pillars and any critical mounting points on that side. A really critical point at this stage is what we call a dry build, so we're going to put all of the revised mechanicals in it and do all the metalwork relating to that. So, you know, different mounting points. There's obviously the bigger transmission tunnel. There's going to be quite a bit of work to do at the back for the independent suspension.
One of the benefits, I guess, with the Escort is pretty much everything's available. Most of the parts off the shelf, pretty reasonably priced, and there are plenty of bits to choose from. The front end setup's pretty straightforward. We've got front uprights and separate strut bodies, which means we've got a nice built-in camber adjustment on here. The lower arms, again, nicely made, so that's all off-the-shelf parts. We've kind of gone with bushes in a couple of places where originally it would have had rose joints, just to keep a bit of compliance. The cross member is what's sort of known in Ford circles as a World Cup cross member, just because it uses the fully enclosed type of bush for the engine mounting, which is what we want to use. Quick rack, 2.4 turns lock to lock, just nice without being oversensitive for road use. The front hubs is aluminium hubs, which go onto these Rix uprights, and then an AP Racing brake setup. It seems a bit premature to be thinking about wheels, but you kind of have to design quite a bit of the car around the wheel. Obviously, there's nothing particularly crazy about this size of fitment. They're going to look perfect on the car, but we do have to bear in mind the wheel diameter for ride height, for obvious reasons, and the wheel width and offset in terms of arch clearances and the tubs on the back, because we are altering the wheel clearance in the shell on the back. We're putting a tub in, and then that kind of leads me on to the rear suspension in that it's critical setting the axle centre lines right at the beginning of the process, because we have to design suspension around that axle centre line. So we've got to determine a ride height, fix that, and then work out the axle centre line in the rear of the shell. And that gives us the height we need to basically fit all the bits of metal into the shell at.
First job was to get the car mounted onto the jig properly. So we've now got these cross beams attached to the jig and the towers, and we've gone a bit overkill and done 6 pairs of towers under there. Once we've got it all securely mounted on the jig, we kind of just picked a random place to start with the rust repair, basically. So we remade the bulkhead section with a really big aperture in it, and then put a row of threaded inserts around it to make basically a bolt-in panel in the back of that. So with that panel removed, you can get in and seal all the way around the seam in there, so it can't rust again. And then the actual panel that bolts in, we're going to fabricate a connection which then ducts the air to our new revised heater box. Once we'd done that, we put the new panel on, but while we were doing that, we knew it was going to be tight on the back of this engine, so we slimmed this lip down here just to give us that little bit more clearance on the back of the cylinder head. We're changing both quarter panels completely, so we removed both of the original quarter panels, but it was really nice when we got the quarters off to be able to get to the inner quarter panel and just clean it all up and epoxy primed it all. The engine, as we talked about, is going to be built by Cosworth. They very kindly just lent us basically a similar Duratec with the throttle bodies and the dry sump setup that our engine will have, so we can use that as a dummy to mock up in there and check all the clearances. It's tight, but it's in there, and then once we've kind of done everything we need to do in terms of planning the space around it, running plumbing work, etc., Cosworth will have this back, and then they're going to build up the engine to our spec that we want, and we'll actually go over to Cosworth and film that. We've been working on a lot of the interior design for the car. We're now looking at having the gauges on the front of the dash here, with the heater controls underneath, but actually putting the vents back up onto the top section, adding one each side, so there's 4 rather than the 2 they originally had, and probably having them slightly canted back. It seemed keen for quite a simple luggage storage area in the back rather than any sort of back seat. This area at the front of the back seat is going to be raised. That panel is there as standard, and the seats sort of butt up to it, but we're just raising it up so it has more of a recess behind to stop things flying forward when he hits the brakes hard, which I've no doubt he will be doing.
I think because he's such a down-to-earth guy, and he's a car guy the same as all of us, you know, we have that kind of common ground really, which is great, and you know, he's a really open-minded customer in terms of suggestions and things like that. He knows what he wants at the end, but he's quite happy for people to kind of explore different options and different ideas, and is open to various suggestions, which is perfect.
We had some rust in the floors both sides, which we saw early on. And the kind of more we looked at it, we saw pinholes elsewhere. After a bit of sort of head scratching and toing and froing, we thought, you know what, we're going to be best just to replace the whole floor. and it was also again nice with the floor off to be able to get inside the chassis rails, and we were actually able to epoxy prime inside the hollow section of the chassis rail before we then put the floor on. Obviously got a seat in here now, and that's, you know, the idea is Gordon's going to come in, have a sit in it and see how it feels.
If I understand you correctly, that's trapped between there. That's going to be very stiff.
Yeah, because that's a very big aluminium piece.
This is, isn't it? It's going to be very, very stiff.
And then that's tied back to that.
And so this is your diff mount.
Yeah, that will be a diff mount, basically another tube.
So what's the overhang from?
The overhang there is about, as you see it there,
Okay.
it's quite substantial, the overhang there, but that's going to be tied onto this tube. The tube will be tied to the diff there, and then the wishbone will be separate to the tube.
So you either stiffen this up on the chassis, you tie that back to there, or you tie it back to here, and then you don't need it on the wishbone.
Yeah.
When we first talked about getting a good shell, I expected a pristine, no dents, no rust.
From our experience, a lot of the cars that look outwardly great, you strip them back, and there's a hell of a lot of
I was going to
bodge
say, in watching the blogs, that is the good thing.
You can slide it fore and after. We've got the slider working if you want to sort of try out. But the biggie that Nat probably wants to talk about is the steering wheel position, which is, you know,
I'd like,
nice.
we want your thoughts initially before we start putting too many of ours in. But
is that the right diameter? That's what it's going to be, yes?
I would say smaller, but it's your preference, really. That would be mine.
I wouldn't go more than an inch smaller, though.
No. How tall are you, by the way?
6'4". Feels a little bit high.
Yeah, that's what we both said the same.
But it'll be better, obviously, with a smaller wheel. It's this angle here. Because you don't really want to ever pull your shoulder forward when you're at the top of the wheel. Oh, I can hear it now.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
Oh, it looks great, guys.
So this is kind of the idea we've come up with at the minute. It's just extending down the centre section of dash and having basically this sort of panel, which will have the gauges and the heater controls and the headlight switch sort of laid out, just rotary controls on there, and then kind of tying in the look with the main gauges. Not sort of going crazy, overcomplicated. Just some nice gauges in there. That looks great, yeah. And the warning lights just laid out.
It looks period, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I love that look though. That's great. Yeah,
great, fantastic. I guess next decision is on the seats, whether we do the whole centre in the tartan or whether we just do a small panel in the tartan.
Yeah, actually, I hadn't considered just doing one section. I think that's an excellent idea because I had a Brabus Smart, and that had Murray tartan seats, the whole seat, and it is a bit in your face.
That's what we thought.
And the rest of this is really, I love this design. You know, it's really sort of knocked back in a way, but nice and retro and crisp. I quite like the subtlety of just one, actually.
Yeah. This sort of bulkhead area, you wanted some of the tartan there, and we were thinking just a sort of small window of tartan, which kind of ties in with that same. That would run all the way across.
That would be perfect. Yeah, absolutely perfect. Yeah.
Steering wheel. Momo have just brought that out, which I think looks amazing.
I don't like in a classic car where the rim's too thick, and that looks like it's got a thin rim.
Yeah.
And it's your black and silver again.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll sort out the badge.
Right. Looking at exterior, and there's, as we've kind of discussed before, the Escort's so sort of minimal. There's not a lot you can change.
Yeah, because I was talking about trying to incorporate slots somewhere, wasn't I?
Yeah.
I just wanted one other subtle body mod that wasn't super obvious, because I really want the thing to look like a twin cam. And one of the other things we talked about was maybe a portion of this gets blacked out, or maybe you put the slots in that. So one thing I wouldn't mind is an artificially big chunk out of the rear skirt with exhaust, rather than hanging out the bottom. I quite like it's a deliberate chunk out of that, and the exhaust a bit higher up. I think if the pipe's there, the Escort definitely needs to be that side.
Yeah. Tick, tick, tick. Done. Excellent. Most people, kind of the household name Cosworth, you spring to mind is Sierra, Escort, Cosworth, and they were powered by the YB, which was a development in, I guess, the 80s, mid-80s. kind of in pursuit of touring car victory, really. I mean, it was developed, I guess, for the Sierra touring cars, but then, of course, they had to do the homologation versions for touring car, and then it made sense to do a road-going version. And the name just shot from being purely a motorsport scene thing to everybody wanting a Cosworth.
And they were relatively affordable at the time to sort of the everyday person, and that's what made them.
And that's kind of continued with Ford, really, is they do amazingly fast cars on sort of everyday money, which is something that's interesting.
But what we do is we pull it all apart, we check everything's fine, we crack test, deburr any key bits, and then we'll start putting it together. So the dry sump system on it is our own bespoke dry sump system. We then put Cosworth pistons, which we manufacture in-house, rods, our own specification of camshafts, valve springs. We do some machining on the head to get the airflow better, and then we have barrel throttle system as well that we put on, similar to the throttle systems that we looked at on the Formula One engines earlier.
I saw this plaque on your Instagram page the other day, and it kind of brought it home to me a bit about who we're actually building this car for. Now, this was his first Grand Prix victory, the first car design of his, which is only a year after he started at Brabham, and he was only 27. That was amazing. How good was that? Right, we better get back to the workshop and do some work. Start at the front. We finished all the metal work for the oil cooler arrangement. We've got the outer front panel on, that's just a standard replacement panel. And then coinciding really nicely with that, the carbon bonnet arrived. So we got the carbon bonnet on there, and then it was a case of getting the replacement wings on and getting those all aligned. But we're pretty happy with how the gaps are all sitting now. We started getting sort of ever extending lead time, shall we say, on the aluminium door skins. And in the meantime, I also saw in person some aluminium skins that were done for a Cortina. We actually decided to just go with the steel ones. You know, the final kind of decider on that being that the steel skins, these ones are really, really good quality. So we stripped the old skins off the doors, so it was just the framework in there. We epoxy primed the inside of these new outer skins, and also at the same time as the skins were removed, we epoxy primed the part of the inner framework that you can't get to once the skin's attached. Once we got the doors reskinned and we're totally happy with the gaps all around them, we turned our attention to the interior. There's quite a substantial change to the look of the dashboard. We've actually changed the shape of the entire lower part of the dash. From a cosmetic point of view, it was going to be difficult to make the column much lower and not just look like a sort of hanging down appendage on the bottom of the dash. And also from a strength point of view, difficult to make a mounting for it that's that far below anything structural. So it made sense to drop the whole dash down and have a structural part of it that we could mount the column to, so it's strong, but also kind of cosmetically you don't have this column hanging down miles below the dash. Immediately after Gordon's trial fitting, he had the seat just mounted on some real temporary kind of flimsy brackets. We've now made up the final brackets for that now, so the seat mounts are done. And then we had to do this cross member section here, which kind of adds a structural section for where the gearbox cross member bolts in underneath. And then the final bit we've been working on was this sort of bulkhead panel that's going to sit behind the seats, which again has a couple of purposes. It adds strength to the shell there, but it also stops luggage flying around. You know, he wants this luggage storage area in here, and obviously driving the car in a spirited fashion, which I imagine he will, you don't want things flying around when you hit the brakes.
Well, we've made a bit of progress since last time. We've got some bits attached to the back of the car now, which is a bit of progress. There's another plate that's got to go on, the double shear plate that holds the other side of the front wishbone mount. That's still got to go on, and the diagonals are tacked on now. And then this side's sort of loosely mocked up with the wishbone. There's the toe link still got to go in here on the other side of the wishbone, and then the upright's just loosely chucked on at the moment, just to give us an idea of where everything is. There's obviously going to be a strut coming off there, going up into a turret that we've got to fabricate into the arch tubs. The strut, I've done a mock-up strut, which is Freelander upright, as we talked about before. We're going to lose this bottom lug, that's going to be cut off, but otherwise it'll be a standard Freelander upright, so it's sort of easy enough to replace. And then we're doing a camber adjustment through pucks on the upright. So basically that sets the camber, that pivots and gives you about 2.5 degrees of camber adjustment either way, and then the pucks drop in so that can't slip and adjust itself over time. Once it's set, that gets done up and that's fixed.
I suppose we've been talking a lot about dry build, and as if everybody knows exactly what I'm on about, and I suppose we should go into a bit more detail on that, because it's a very, very important part of the process we do of building a car. And the reason really for doing it is so that when we get a painted shell and we're building the car, we don't find sort of unforeseen problems that mean we have to drill, cut, grind any part of the car. And on a sort of custom built car, it's amazing how many stumbling blocks you come across. The lights and grille mount into the front panel, the rear lights mount into the rear panel. They've been changed. And although they're replacement panels, you know full well with these things that stuff is not going to just bolt straight on. So everything that might affect metalwork, we build onto the car while it's still bare metal before we paint it. But it's things like fitting door handles. Well, we've done door skins on it. They are Escort door skins, and so supposedly the door handles will just bolt in, but will they really? And I don't want to find that out when it's painted. So fitting the door handles, fitting the quarter window frames. Again, we've reskinned the doors. There's a gap that frame has to fit into between the outer skin and the inner frame, and if we've somehow got that not quite right, I'm going to find out later that we've got to mash something to get the window frame in. So we want to find that out now if it doesn't fit. Making provision for all the wiring and plumbing. So not only making holes in bulkheads for where wiring or plumbing passes through, but also drilling the holes that we'll put threaded inserts in, which will actually attach the clips that mount the wiring, the clips that mount the plumbing. So that riv nut insert is going into a painted hole, so there's no bare metal involved. We're not drilling the painted shell and then exposing bare steel, which could rust later. Ultimately, with the dry builds, we end up with a car with engine, gearbox, axle, all the suspension bolted in, on its wheels and tyres, literally sitting on the floor like a finished car, with the seats in, with the steering wheel in, with the instruments in, so that Gordon can sit in it and say, you know, yes, I'm happy with that, and we can assess when it's a painted shell, all the parts are just going to bolt on. All the major changes we've done are all back here, but I will just mention the dash, because we were talking about this last time. We've done the kind of main part of the dash, and the other thing we've done since then is the actual instrument binnacle. We didn't want to use the original one because he's got such a lower steering wheel position. With the instruments in the original position, the wheel would have completely obscured him. The actual back of this, we've done sort of clearance holes for where the LEDs are going to go. There'll be a trim panel on here in anodised aluminium, but then the actual instrument holes, we've made these the same size as the instrument so that we can use the mounting bracket of the instrument to hold the fascia panel in. And we've done the same with this, so that when we've made the anodised aluminium panel, rather than having it bolted on with any visible fixings, we can actually use the instrument retainers to sandwich both panels together so there's no visible fixing. The biggie at the back, kind of starting with the structural tube. We've put a tube across here, and that was planned sort of when we were talking about the design, the interior design and the structure of the car, for a number of reasons. A, it gives us a nice stiff sort of cross brace on the car there on the shell, which stiffens up the shell at the back there. Also gives us a really nice curved transition between the parcel shelf and the bulkhead, and just a neat way of doing that. And thirdly, gives us mounting points for the harnesses, and these will just have blanking plugs in them when they're not in use. We've obviously made all of these panels, the parcel shelf with the separate panel on both sides there, the bulkhead panel with the little infill each side, which ties it up to the inner arch tub. So these tubs have been made to allow us a good amount of clearance on the inside of the wheel. The central panel there, we've just done a slight sort of folded cross into it, just to stop it drumming, and it's the same reason really on the parcel shelf. The other thing you can see is these access hatches which access the top of the turrets, so we can get to the fixings that hold the top mounts in for the rear struts, and also the damping adjuster knobs are going to be on top of the struts. From this side you can see a more critical suspension related structure that we've been working on. At the top here you can see where we've added the sort of section that raises up to the parcel shelf, which is that cavity that we saw from the top, where you've got the adjuster knobs and the top mounts for the suspension there. And then quite notably the entire floor area here on the sort of over axle area has been completely refabricated from scratch. The dry build process, getting the car to a stage where we could get the wheels on, sit it on the floor, move the suspension through its travel, and just get all the little parts on there. And this is all just checking everything fits now before we get it to the paint stage. One person, probably more than any, who's going to be excited by seeing this is Gordon, because he's going to be coming over to have a look at it in this state, sit in it, see if he's happy with the positions of all the controls, the steering wheel, the gear stick, check the visibility of the instruments, and he's going to be looking at, you know, the underside of it, basically making sure he's happy with everything on it. So there,
Well,
there it
there
is.
she is.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It's,
Oh, the wheels look nice, don't they?
yeah. The big metalwork changes are obviously all of the rear bulkhead area for the struts, the turrets that are in there.
Yeah.
We've got all the rear suspensions on, so we'll show you on the lift in a sec.
And the dash, of course, yeah.
Yeah, we'll have a, well, you can have a sit in a minute.
Yeah, it looks
and
good.
Go through and see how it feels.
I would say an inch up and an inch, or 3/4 of an inch this way.
Yeah.
Be about right. Which also gives you more clearance here
Yeah.
as it comes up.
Great.
I think the throw's fine there. Maybe just a bit more crank.
Yeah.
It's a bit, just a bit of a straight arm stretch. It's also nice to drop down a bit from the wheel rather than reach forward from the wheel.
So, and then, you know, we were talking about bracing the engine bay up last time. We decided in the end to do these sort of sculpted gussets
Yes.
in the corners there, to try and add some of that sort of anti, you know, parallelogramming sort of effect. Front end's all relatively off-the-shelf parts, although it's nothing like standard. It's you've got the camera adjustment on the strut, whereas you'd normally have an adjustable length lower track control arm. This is kind of the one of the better kind of rally orientated front setups. We've just modified certain bits of it to be rubber rather than, because it would normally be rose jointed on the inner end.
Yeah, most of the load we want to spread into the side of the rail. But yeah, I think.
Oh yeah, you've got a pretty good grip on that, haven't you?
Yeah. And it's split between the front fore and aft, because this rear brace takes a lot of the load as well, which is then spread into there, and then that's tied directly up into the turret as well.
Yeah, that's pretty stiff, isn't it?
A far cry from a standard Mark I Escort back end.
Yes. I like the way it looks standard.
Should handle
when
it.
it's on the ground, it all looks.
Yeah, it should handle the torque a bit better.
Right, we're at 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if there's anything else, that's straight.
Oh, that's fine. I think you've seen everything, so as long as
Yeah,
you're,
it looks
as long as
great.
you're happy.
Yeah, it looks great, guys.
then we're
Really
just
does.
We have 100% completed metalwork on the car. Once we completed the metalwork, we were happy with that. Moved the shell into our blasting room, blasted the shell, carried out the metal spray zinc process that we do on the underside, epoxy primed the outside of it, and yeah, it's in the body prep area. Already started work on prepping it for paint, so it's in Mark and Gaz's hands now. They're starting with the seam sealing work and they're going to push it through to paint. One of the first things we tackled since we last did the video was the dry sump tank and provision for that on the car.
I've decided to design a dry sump tank to suit the car, mainly because there's no space in the engine bay. And when it's fitted in the car, that piece there then sticks through the hole in the front panel, gets fed with the oil from the oil cooler, centrifuge, drops in, down there. That bit holds the oil, fed off to the engine, and then breather in there and an oil filler cap. But that's the basics of it.
And then kind of moving on from that, it was making provision for all of the other plumbing and wiring, and that was a kind of biggie that we wanted to get through now, again, so we're not having to chop around the shell too much once it's painted. So if you look in the engine bay here, you'll see various holes that we've made. The two down there are for the heater plumbing. There's going to be aluminium bulkhead fittings through there. Over this side, these are going to be the engine management wiring. We're going to build a loom ourselves for this, which is going to have bulkhead connectors, so you can essentially unplug two plugs and that separates the whole engine loom from the car. Looking over at the other side, there is a hole under here, which is where the front part of the main chassis loom comes through, and that means we've got the sort of main car wiring loom coming up the inside to a socket here, and then the front end of the wiring loom will plug on here, and then that routing continues all the way. There's always studs or riv nut holes wherever we're going to route the wiring across the front there. So also fuel system plumbing has been completely done. We're going to have a pressure regulator mounted down here. We've put holes in for threaded inserts where that's going to mount. And then the hose routing up to the fuel rail. We're coming up to here with bulkhead connectors through these two holes here. And we'll have 90-degree fittings on there, which will just sweep round behind the airbox to the fuel rail. And then we've done threaded inserts or holes for them all the way down the chassis legs for the fuel lines to run to where the rest of the fuel system is. And to that side we're going to have a fabricated reservoir for the brake and clutch system. 2 holes down there where the unions are going to pass through that feed the master cylinders, which are inside. So moving on to the back, we've done the mounts down here for the battery tray. Battery will sit here. Fuel tank. We've now put some mounting points in there, up there and over there, which is how the tank will be mounted. Because the fuel tank and the pump and filter are all in the boot, we wanted to totally separate the air in the boot from the air in the car. There's an aluminium piece that bonds in underneath here, which means that the ventilation from the rear shelf passes through to this area here and exhausts out the back, but doesn't connect into the boot, which it does as standard. So with the car this way, first thing that strikes you really is the fact that it's bright silver, which is the zinc spray process we've done on the underside. But what we can also see with it this way up is all of the other provision we've made for running fuel lines and that kind of thing. So on the inside edges of these chassis legs there are holes for riv nuts to be put into after it's painted, which is where we'll clip brake lines, fuel lines. Now the final thing we'll do is wax inject all the high sections, and we make sure that's thinned down to a point that when it's hot it seeps into all of the sort of nooks and crannies. The final thing we did before it was blasted was go around every seam on the shell and TIG braze those seams, and that's done that. And that was the very last step before blasting it and zinking it. We blasted it, done the hot zinc spray on the underside of the car, and we'd given it a coat of epoxy primer, and that's kind of the first step really, is when the shell's freshly blasted, we then give the whole thing a coat of epoxy primer on the outside, which is directly on the metal, and that kind of gives it its proper foundation protection. From there we do the seam sealing on the shell, and then sort of moving on from that, it's the initial filler work. There's always going to need to be a small quantity, you know, you're talking like less than 1 millimetre depth, but just to give you a material there to block sand and get everything dead straight. And then after that, we put a coat of polyester over it, which is basically the same makeup as body filler, except it's in a sprayable form. And that gives you an all-over coating to block sand. Guide coat over that, and then we start block sanding that down. And then kind of moving on towards the first stages of sealing everything in and making it non-porous. We use a product called Raptor, which was originally used for lining the back of pickup trucks. And we do the underside of the car in Raptor, tinted the final body colour. Then we do the inside, all of the non-visible surfaces. That's all done in Raptor as well, just because it's harder wearing than a typical acrylic paint. We did the Raptor on all the inner wing area with the wings removed. We then set up the wings and Raptored the underside of the front wings. And then, while we were doing that, we basically masked off the areas that were going to be welded. Then we did the final alignment of the front wings and welded them on, the spot welded along the top, as they would have been originally. We then go back under there, clean up around where all the sort of soot and any scale from the welding, seam seal that, and then basically go in and just Raptor the under front wing area again to re-go over any of the areas that were affected by the welding and any bits that were still left bare metal from welding. Once we'd got the wings on, obviously that meant we could do all the absolute final alignment on the panels, do basically a mock-up of the doors, bonnet, boot lid, and this is with latches, seals, so everything's absolutely in its final position, as it will be when it's a completely built car. And then that allows us to block sand across the shuts on the car, blocking that polyester coat back so that the sort of line down the side of the car is absolutely crisp. That way when you look down the side of the car when it's all painted, it's just going to be a perfect flat, you know, reflection all the way along the car. Once we block that polyester coat down, we take that down to 320 grit, and then we go on with what's on it now, which is an epoxy primer again. So that's a second layer of epoxy primer, which completes the job of sealing all of the porous substrates in. The initial thing after we've done this epoxy coat, we go around and just scotch up and key up where any remaining unsealed seams were. seal those seams, leave that to cure, and then do the final wet sand. So we wet sand the whole lot, 800 grit, and then yeah, we're basically then ready for the final paint. So the panels have been taken off, they'll be painted separately, and then once all of that lot's been baked and cured for a few days, we'll then move on to the process of wet sanding the final paint finish and buffing that up, which kind of takes it from a from the gun finish, which is kind of how you would expect if you went out and bought a new car. That's the kind of finish you get, and then we'll wet sand that till it's absolutely dead flat and buff it up so it's kind of like glass flat. But you'll only ever find that basically on a car that's had that process done. You look at any new car, there's a level of orange peel there, and the only cars that don't, i.e. things like Lamborghini, Rolls-Royce, they do manually wet sand and buff their cars.
So this is a McPherson strut being dynoed, and we're doing the compression cycle, and we run it through a series of speed checks, and we check that the valving will give us a good damping result on the speed up and the speed down inside the stroke. So it's very important that you get both sides of the stroke to be a reasonable mirror image. It's possible to have it so that as it speeds up, it produces one damping result.
Yeah.
And as it slows down, going through the same set of speeds, you get a different damping result. From a pure shock point of view, it's always nice to get a shock that has a balanced upstroke and downstroke.
We are constrained by a 13-inch wheel because we want to make the car look similar and look sort of correct to the period, and we need to use a handbrake caliper. We want discs on the back, we need a handbrake on the back. The best option we kind of concluded was this, which is the trusty old Ford Sierra unit. It quickly became obvious it wasn't going to fit inside a wheel with any sort of off-the-shelf disc that we initially looked into. We deduced that if we move the caliper in, we've got a chance if we used a smaller disc. So we got a smaller disc with a slightly shorter top hat, which moved the disc outboard a little bit, which gave us a better chance of the various bits of caliper clearing the various bits of upright at that diameter. We're trying to keep the service parts standard, and the service parts will be wheel bearing, the brake caliper claw, the disc, the pads, and the CV joints.
After hundreds of hours of prep work, you know, you're literally talking 2 or 3 hours to completely do the final exterior paintwork on the car. We've sprayed it with just a 2-pack acrylic, solid colour. It's Ford Ermine white, which is the original twin cam white colour. You know, you can get 2-pack solid like so kind of glass flat, but it still doesn't have that kind of miles deep brand new car look about it, which we kind of wanted to avoid. Once the paint had hardened off for the best part of a week, we do the wet sanding and polishing on it, which is what takes it from a gun finish where there's a level of orange peel there to being completely flat. And that's start with stiff blocks with 1500 grit sanded wet, gradually go down finer, so they'll usually then move to a 2000 grit. Then they'll use 3000 grit discs on a DA, still wet. The initial kind of hard blocking is just to clip down that orange peel and literally trim the tops off. They'll use a dark guide coat on a light colour like this until you can't see any guide coat left. And then the progressive finer grades are basically to get the sanding marks out from that initial 1500 grit. Once you've got down to 3000 in this case, then we can go in with the compound. We paint it with the panels off, so the doors, for instance, are painted as a complete unit, inside and out, as in one go. And then everything assembled together afterwards, which just means there's no kind of hidden areas where you can't quite get a nice paint finish. Engine bay was painted at the same time as the whole of the exterior of the car, which is pretty high pressure on the guy doing the paint. So, you know, this is like the painter's worst nightmare doing in an engine bay like this. What we're actually working on now is these fabricated tanks, which will have kind of level tops on both of them. The way we wanted to mount them, we were trying to make it so there was no visible fasteners. So we've got the unions that come out of the bottom of the tank that feed, in this case, the brake fluid to the brake and clutch master cylinders, and in that case the screen wash through the bulkhead, they actually create the mounting point for half of the tank, and then we've got a threaded boss that we've machined and then welded to the bottom of the tank, which kind of forms the third mount point. And the idea there is that when they're in situ, they kind of look almost like they're floating there. Yeah, I guess one of the obvious changes standing here is that the last time the engine wasn't even back here. Cosworth were building this still. Once we had the engine here, we wanted to get it on the subframe because the whole lot goes up from underneath. You literally put the engine onto its mounts on the front subframe and then just raise the whole lot up under the car and drop the shell over it and bolt it in. And then obviously getting the engine and gearbox together. The engine comes without flywheel or clutch. So I spoke to Dave at Retro Ford. We've basically got a traditional sprung type organic friction plate, but with a heavily uprated billet pressure plate over it onto a billet flywheel. The gearbox that we mocked up with was actually a used one, but then the final one that's in the car now is a brand new one. We just got a new gearbox from Mazda. So the black you see here, those components are generally steel, and they've been blasted, hot zinc metal sprayed, and then powder coated. The diff cover, which is billet aluminium, that's been anodised, and then the diff, which was just a scrapyard diff from a Sierra, that's a brand new diff from Quaife with one of their automatic torque biasing diffs in it. It's got a 3.6:1 final drive ratio. These are obviously the damper reservoirs for the Nitron struts. We're just having some mounts for those CNC machine. We've drawn them up on CAD, and they'll mount the reservoirs on these diagonals here and here, and they're like a billet clamp that kind of clamps onto there and then clamps onto the body of the reservoir. You can see the brakes. We've got the Sierra calipers on there. Every link has got a bush on one end and a rose joint on the other, and these are really high spec Aurora rose joints. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much covered everything on the rear, and I'll just show you the front. So yeah, front subframe, much the same treatment as all the rear. So all of the steel components, the lower arms, the actual subframe itself, the compression struts, they were all sent away to be blasted, zinc metal sprayed and powder coated. The steering rack, that was already a fresh built rack, but the paint that they use, you can virtually blow it off. So we stripped the rack back down, painted that with a really tough polyurethane paint, and rebuilt that again. And also likewise the track rods themselves, which is often a thing that's kind of overlooked. They tend to just have a bare steel finish, but it does deteriorate quickly. So we painted those with that polyurethane paint as well. So when we had the car bare metal, we fabricated a plinth at the bottom there to sit the fuel tank onto. We kind of integrated the design where the fuel tank was going to sit, and we integrated mounts into the shell for it. Then we did the actual drawings for the tank itself. It's a foam-filled tank. It's got a VDO dip tube type sender in the middle of the top, which has got a float in the middle for the feed to the gauge, and then it's got a drop-down pot in the middle under here, which drops into a recess that we incorporated into the body shell. And that's only connected to the main part of the tank via some very small holes. So when the tank's reasonably low on fuel and you're cornering hard or braking accelerating hard, doesn't matter where the fuel sloshes in the tank, that pot will always have a sort of reserve of fuel in it, so there's no interruption to the fuel supply to the engine. Batteries obviously in situ. We did the mounts for that when the shell was a bare metal shell. Coming back to the front of the car has led me to think about one of the things I'm quite proud of on this car, which is the bonnet release, which on these early cars was just a button in the grille. On the later cars they had a cable inside. I think we talked about this last time. In fact, we might have seen it being done, but now we've had it black anodised, you can kind of see the full effect that it looks for all the world like it's just the normal late style grille with no bonnet release button, except this slat here releases the bonnet. And then we talked about the tanks that we were just in the process of making. They're ready to go for anodising now. There's a level sensor in the back. I don't know if I mentioned that before. We've got a threaded boss in the back that a float type level sensor sits in, because we wanted to have level sensing for a warning light, but didn't want an ugly cap with a wire trailing off over it. So we've got a real nice knurled aluminium cap that goes on there, but it's got still got a level sensor in the back. And then that side's the screen wash, and that feeds down through the bulkhead into this, which is a large screen wash tank, but we've obviously done it to serve two purposes. It also doubles as the footrest for the passenger. The screen wash pump mounts on the back of that tank and then feeds up through the bulkhead, through a pipe that goes to here, and that feeds fluid out to these two plastic extrusions on each side. They're open on this end and closed on the other end, and they have a row of very small pinholes in this back edge, which are spaced between the slats of this scuttle panel. In here, the steering column is an Opal Manta steering column, which we chose for a couple of reasons. A, it's a collapsible column, which the original isn't, and B, the switch gear on it we absolutely love, because it's just a single stalk. The look of this stalk is exactly what we wanted for this car. It's kind of just lean and purposeful, and it covers a lot of functions on just one stalk. Pedal box is in. That's just an off-the-shelf Mk I Escort bias pedal box. So the master cylinders now sit up under the dash here. You've got one for the clutch, one for the front brake circuit, and one for the rear brake circuit. And then we've also done the mounts for the ECU, the engine ECU, which sits over that side, sort of on the inside of the footwell panel. And then the PDU sits this side, and I'll talk a bit more about the PDU in a bit.
I think there was scope to maybe compromise on a 4-into-1.
Yeah.
If it had been really tight, but we're still planning to get a 4-into-2-into-1.
Yeah.
The current sort of thinking of engines of this nature is that a 4-into-2-into-1, if you've got long enough primaries, seems to give the benefit of a 4-into-1 in terms of the top end horsepower at the top end of the rev range, without losing any torque in the mid range and lower down the RPM scale.
The guys at BTB made the exhaust system, and they've done a lovely job. Probably the most significant detail really to mention is that we've done a couple of interchangeable sections on it. So we've got a cat in the downpipe. That cat has got flanges both ends with clamps, and we've had BTB make a delete pipe. So you can unclip the cat and clip in the other one. And there are two silencers. There's a large back box and there's a small box just in front of the axle, which is also, we've had a delete pipe made. There's a V-band clamp in front and behind that, so you can just unclamp that silencer and put a straight pipe in. So you can make it quieter or louder depending on what you want, which is an interesting thing, because Gordon definitely said he wanted the car to be loud, not like overbearing and annoyingly loud when you're in the car, but he likes to be able to hear the exhaust note. We've now got the dash top pad that we made Alcantara and fitted. These are the Audi S3 vents that we were using, and these have got a few functions which are quite cool. You turn the ring there to open and close the vent, and then you've also, obviously you can move them around, but then you've also got this here which you push and pull, which directs either the air through the middle or out of the sides, which means we can add a bit more demist. Although we have also put demist vents on here to back that up as well. Your PDU is basically a little box like an ECU that's got three connectors on it. One is the main power feed in from the battery, and then there are two multi-pin connectors. One of them has got a large number, I think 50 odd pins, really small pins, and the other one's on this unit which we're using, which is a 16 channel PDU, has got 16 larger pins on it. And the connector with the large number is the input connector, and the other one is the output connector. And essentially on the output connector, each pin on that plug feeds a wire which goes to a component on the car. So that could be a light or it could be a motor, whatever. They're the output channels. You've got battery voltage being fed into the battery input on there, and then the input connector feeds in from anything like a switch on the car. I've actually got this just connected to give me a live readout at the minute, which is interesting, so I can see the current draws on any channel. So put the headlights on. These are now green because that's the side lights and headlights. If we go back to there, that's side lights only. Side lights drawing 1.8 amps, and that's the total current still. Turn that to the next one, that's headlights input. So that's showing that that input is live, and because of the schematic that I've drawn here, that's turned the headlights on here, which is pulling 9.5 amps. If something does blow, there's a reset button under here, so you can just press the button and reset that circuit. Obviously, if there's a continuing problem, then that problem needs fixing. The big thing that this is all leading up to is the fact that we are now ready to start the engine. We've already taken the plugs out and cranked it and got oil pressure. So yeah, we're literally ready to turn the key. We're just waiting for the guy from Cosworth to turn up. He's going to plug into the ECU, just make sure all the sensor readings on the ECU look sensible. And then yeah, first fire up.
Right, there you go, gentlemen. T-map is T-map, so B, what's back then?
Well, yeah, we'll check it on some other cylinders, but if we've got spark fuel, then it's just at the wrong time. Yes.
Where do you reckon we're at?
Well, I was curious about that, but I was going to wait till we got to that. I was just wondering if there's any chance that that's supposed to be there. That picture would suggest it's actually going that way. Just for ignition. So yeah, that was a successful first fire up. We're pretty much happy now. We've got a sort of basic map on there just for our kind of initial shakedown and testing. And then once we've kind of got through all of that and we're happy that all the basic mechanical functions are working as they should, we'll be taking it to Rolling Road to get it mapped fully. But yeah, I would say that is a pretty successful day.
We often find that the full power stuff at full throttle is very close to optimum, but of course you don't drive everywhere flat out. So, and on a road car particularly, the drivability, cold start, idle, trickling along in traffic, all of those sorts of things are very difficult to recreate on an engine dyno. What we're doing is we're using the Rolling Road to hold the engine speed. And then once I've set that, I can kind of go from no throttle gradually all the way through to full throttle. And the control system on the rollers won't let the engine accelerate anymore. So it allows me to adjust the fuel and ignition using the dyno. As you change the fuel and ignition, you can see the emissions readout change. So we're looking for the best emissions and then adjusting the ignition to get the best possible power and torque without any danger of the engine detonating. And I have to do that for both the main fuel and ignition maps, and then behind that there are lots of other maps that control what happens to the engine when you're on the overrun, when you blip the throttle, when the engine's idling, when it's warming up.
real issue was we blew a little bit of oil out of the diff breather. Not a huge amount, but I think we've got a plan for revising it. But to be fair, as a sort of first time it's ever been used flat out, I think that's a win really. If that's the only niggle. Yeah, made the power as well, made 245 horsepower. So yeah, that was easily as much as we were hoping to get. 176 pound-foot torque at the peak, but yeah, really nice spread. Essentially, when you modify a car significantly, there's a question mark over whether that car's registration is still valid. So to avoid any potential complication, from the very start of this build, we decided we were going to put it through an IVA process. So a lot of what we've been doing for the past probably month and a half, I'd say, has basically been finishing off everything we needed to do for that, getting it through the test, which went well, and it actually only really failed on the speed sensor, which we've got a pickup on one of the front wheels for the Speedo, and because it's an undriven wheel, they don't actually have a way of testing that at the IVA test centre. So it failed on the basis that they couldn't prove the calibration was correct. So we just had that independently checked and gave them a certificate basically to say that it was correct, and yeah, that was that. So we have an IVA certificate for it. Probably the first time you've seen it with everything in there, so the strut braces on, the caps for the reservoirs, we've had them anodised and then laser etched with the various logos on there, oil on there, you've got the brake and the screen wash logos. We've made this cover for the injectors to sort of cover all the wiring for the injectors a while ago, so that's on, and it's got the plaque that Cosworth did. It's quite a cool finishing touch. And then over the last few days, we've had Dale here doing all of the final paintwork, detailing, ceramic coating, everything. That's kind of the final process we do, because once you've got the freshly painted shell, you can start all the build-up work. But just from day-to-day dust and leaning over the car and whatever you're doing with the car, you'll tend to find you get fine scratching. So he comes and gives it a really deep clean.
This has got a composite bonnet and composite boot lid. Anybody that does machining will know they're quite difficult to get up to a decent cutting temperature. So the majority of the hours went into the bonnet and the boot lid on this vehicle. Over 4 hours per panel just to get them to a second stage of finish, and then another 2 hours to actually get the gloss levels out of them. And basically what it does for us is puts an extra hard shell over the original paintwork. So once it's cleaned, you're only ever cleaning the ceramics, which is a lot harder than the paint.
We're happy with that now. All testing done. Carl's been out in it quite a bit, done quite a few miles in it, completely happy. His summary was he didn't want to get out of it, which is what we were aiming for. Carl and I are going down tomorrow to deliver that back to Gordon personally, and we'll see how he gets on.
So, yes, so we delivered it on I think it was the 21st. We really wanted to get it to him for Christmas so we could have it in his garage and, well, hopefully drive it. Stopped for Christmas, and then I got a phone call from him about 3 days ago, so 14th, 15th of January, basically saying he hadn't driven it yet because it's so nice at the minute. He said he would like to get it to some shows before it gets completely messed up. But obviously, we do want to do a final episode, which will be him driving the car. But organising that is a lot of work because he's an extremely busy man. We're obviously quite busy as well. So not only has he got to have already driven the car, preferably, and be used to it, then we've got to find a free day for when he's available to drive the car, and we're available. And then we've got to choreograph getting us all together to film it all. So we're just going to wait for the right moment. So it might be, it might be weeks, it might be months, and there definitely will be a final episode 17.